our distinguished panel today is myself, Dr. Rachel Vanderhill, is moderating the panel, and I'm in the Department of Government and International Affairs. And then I'll start on this end, and you can hold your applause if you until the end. I have Dr. DeMars, who's also in the Department of Government and International Affairs. I have the Reverend Robinson, who is a college chaplain. Probably most of you know who he is. And then we also have Dr. Gilbert, who introduced herself earlier, also from the Department of Government and International Affairs. All right, so with that, we'll turn it over to you, and we will take our first question. So, show of hands, questions. Okay, right there, sir, so you'll get the microphone.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what is the, I would say, like the best possible outcome that you guys see happening, like a peaceful agreement coming realistically? What would you say?
So maybe we'll direct that question to Dr. Mars. Are you willing to take a stab at that?
Best and possible? That's the... Israel has not, under Prime Minister Netanyahu, has no plans for the future of Gaza Strip once they're finishing attempting to destroy Hamas. The record of these attempts to destroy these groups is not good. They either survive materially, or at least as an idea, or they pop up in a new form. And Israel is not planning ahead, and they can't get rid of Netanyahu until the war is finished. And my guess is, so I don't have a best case. I have a range of really bad and worst case scenarios. I'm very pessimistic about this situation. The Netanyahu government is the worst possible government for Israel to have at this point of time, even in their 75-year history. And I've got points on that. Some of them have been made by the students. But the worst of the worst possibilities involve escalation, because behind this attack is Iran. And I handed out only 35 of these sets of maps, and the first one zooms out a little bit more than the maps that the students used, and focused on Iran's proxy armies in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Bahrain, very small, and Gaza among the Palestinian territories. They're much weaker in the West Bank. And so this attack comes from Hamas in Gaza, but it is designed, and the brutality of the attack, the scale of it in relationship to historical attacks on Israel, the brutality, the rape of women, videotaped and put online next to their dead friends, this level is designed to provoke an overreaction. It's standard insurgency, a weapon of the weak. And Netanyahu may be falling into Hamas and Iran's trap. So heading off, best case scenario, it doesn't escalate. Doesn't bring in Hezbollah, which has 150,000 rockets that will aimed at Israel, that will greatly overwhelm the anti-missile system, the Iron Dome system of Israel. And that's the best case scenario that I can see.
All right, another question. Okay, gentleman in the blue in the back there, hold on 1 second, the microphone is coming to you.
All right, so my question's mostly where I think a lot of people are wondering how Israel let this happen, in the sense where it has one of the strongest security apparatuses in the world, and seemingly they kind of got what they wanted from this in the sense that they've always been trying to have a pretext into going into Gaza, and now he stated, I think it was yesterday or the day before on CNN, that Israel will monitor Gaza and be kind of the governing body there for the time being after they're done conquering it. So, is there any belief or any theories you might have as to how Israel even let an attack of this scale happen, or if they intentionally let it happen, or something of the sort?
How about we turn to Dr. Gilbert for that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a massive political reckoning in Netanyahu's future. And essentially what we've had is a security failure. There was a complete failure on the part of Israeli intelligence services to pick up on what was happening. But I think this also, I think we tend to sort of think of forces like Israel's and the United States as being sort of like all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing. Humans are fallible. And I think we need to acknowledge the fact that Hamas knew what it was doing, has been preparing for this for a long time, and had a lot of resources to put into planning this. And you can see the ways in which they sort of thought this stuff out in order to maximize the effectiveness of this attack, on pinpointing the weaknesses of the system, and also thinking timing, right? This happened at Sukkot, which is a holiday which sort of marks the end of the High Holy Days. So, and that was a pretty intentional move. So I think that, I don't necessarily ascribe to this idea that this was sort of an intentional decision to let this happen. I err more on sort of assuming that governments are generally incompetent rather than maniacal. But this is going to hurt Netanyahu's political future. Already his polling numbers are way down. If there was an election today, he would lose dramatically. So the whole rally around the flag effect is not happening for him. And I think his coalition would be in big trouble if one of the parties that was on the slide earlier, which has a lot of members of the Israeli Defense Forces in it, had not decided to join the coalition. So.
All right, thank you. Next question.
Thank you, and great job on the presentation. My question is, where do you see the United States kind of going from here? Like, what role do you think we should play?
All right, let's send that back to Dr. DeMar. Then he teaches American foreign policy.
Okay.
Have the next one.
Well, the Biden administration's response has been to send 2 aircraft carrier battle groups. That's an aircraft carrier and about 15 other ships. One to the eastern Mediterranean, and the other just south of that in the northern Red Sea. The Biden administration also sent a guided missile submarine. Former Ohio-class submarine formerly had nuclear missiles on it. Now it has 140 Tomahawk missiles with supposedly conventional weapons. And it did this in a very demonstrative way, surfacing the sub for a photo opportunity. And it's a warning to Iran and to Hezbollah, another Iranian proxy group in Lebanon, north of Israel, not to escalate. But that very commitment could pull us into an escalation. Because if you follow the maps farther, Iranian proxies are already escalating attacks on American forces. 20 American soldiers have been casualties, probably mostly wounded, from attacks against, this is the back one, their positions in Syria and Iraq. Iran's angle here is to draw the United States and Israel into a war with its proxies and keep itself out.
All right.
So we don't have a strategy. The Biden administration does not have a strategy, and no one else does, for how to deal with this.
All right, there was, I think there was a question over here. Question, yeah. Can you pass it back over here? Yeah, there's a young lady here who's been waiting for a while. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I was just going to ask, considering that Jerusalem is supposed to be an international city, do you all think that's going to be maintained, or do you think in a while it's going to eventually be turned over to either Israel or Palestine due to its religious importance?
Do you want to weigh in on that, Ron?
Sure.
Yeah.
I would hope that it would be a city for all people. I think the previous administration, the Trump administration, made a mistake by putting the embassy in Jerusalem and not keeping it out, even though technically it's supposed to be there, but that was very provocative. And they essentially took the two-state solution off the table. The Biden administration does have a strategy. I have it listed here in 5 parts, and I think a lot of that but the strategy has to unfold as events unfold, right? So, and then you have to be able to adapt as that happens. But I would hope it would be an international city. I've been participating almost every day in a Zoom prayer time with people in Israel and in the West Bank. Do that at 11 o'clock. There are Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Druze who are participating. And that group who live there get together once a month and have a meal together. They disagree vehemently about a lot of territorial issues, but they have a concrete agreement about the nature of that city. And so that for me is hopeful. I think if we just pay attention to nation states or military groups or terrorist groups, we forget the people who are activists for peace, and there are lots of them around. In our class, we look not only at the, which is peace and conflict in the Middle East, we look not only at what's happening from a governmental perspective, but we enter into what it's like to be a person there. And each student in the class has a role play that they play. And then we learn about people like Dahlia and Bashir, who had a relationship, one Jewish, one Muslim. We talk about what's it like if you're a 9-year-old and you live in Gaza City, and this week a bomb came in, maybe saying made in USA, but at least it came from Israel, and it killed your family. What does that do to continue recruitment for Hamas? So it gets very complicated, and lots has to be done to build peace, and there are strategies for doing that. I'm hopeful about that.
Thank you. I think was there a hand in the far back row there. Thank you.
Thank you. You guys probably get to see me, but recently the UN Security Council held a vote calling for a ceasefire, in which I believe 4 out of the 15 countries voted in favor of the ceasefire in order to prevent any more deaths on both the Palestinian and Israeli side.
Yeah.
My question is, what are some of the primary implications kind of preventing the possibility of a ceasefire at the moment?
All right, Dr. Gilbert, why don't you take that question?
Sure. So basically, yeah, you would think that, the U.S. being sort of interested in kind of creating stability and status quo might be in favor of something like a ceasefire. Now, the reason that the United States, this is also something some of the EU countries have been sort of tangling with as well, is they see a conflict between calling for a ceasefire, which is a full-out cessation of hostilities, and their argument that Israel has a right to defend itself against Hamas. So that's why the U.S. vetoed it. Now, the legal-ish loophole that the U.S. and other countries are trying to sort of thread here is not a ceasefire, but let's have a cessation or like a pause, in a humanitarian pause in fighting. Now, humanitarian pauses could be sort of like, okay, we're just going to call this thing for like 48 hours, or it could be there are certain zones which we promise not to attack for either particular period of time or something like that. And so the reason that the US and other, and especially European countries, are sort of been pushing that angle is, again, they see this as sort of allowing them to say, like, yes, Israel has a right to defend itself, but we also know that, like, the people of Gaza are starving because of the lack of aid that's getting through right now. So, yeah.
All right, thank you. The gentleman on this side, we don't know where the microphone ended up. You can pass it down. Yes, you in the baseball cap.
My question is, per the Geneva Convention, is Israel committing a genocide? Because intent has been established by words of Netanyahu, the IDF minister, of flattening Gaza, of turning it into a parking lot, of different, so has intent been determined, and is Israel committing a genocide?
Somebody want to take that?
Maybe a couple of us could take that one?
Yeah.
I'll take on a little of that. I don't know that I'll be able to answer your question about a genocide, but the Geneva Convention is very important. Israel has been in violation of Geneva Convention laws with respect to the occupation for quite a while. But Netanyahu says they don't need to subscribe to those laws because he maintains they have integrated them into their own constitution, so Israel's no longer subject to them, and that's part of the reason they want to change the courts. So it would, to make them more far right, to embrace that idea. So you're on target with the Geneva Convention, and yeah, I mean that's part of the issue there.
So I preemptively printed out the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention of 1948 because I was wondering if this question was going to come up. And so the language that the international community signed on to is that genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part, which I think is what you were getting at with the statement, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And I mean, right now, I think there's a lot of sort of trying to establish, I mean, some of the language that has come out of members of the Israeli cabinet, it's hard to say that it doesn't sound like that, right? I mean, especially when you think about how far right some of these parties are. I mean, Otzma Yehudit, which is one of the smaller far-right parties in the coalition right now, they're fascists. Like, the name means Jewish power. They're not subtle about their perspective on Palestinians and Arabs in general. Now, we also have this term that comes out of the former Yugoslavia, which is ethnic cleansing, which is more focused on, well, sort of, and the language and the definition for that is the purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographic areas. And I think, so right now there's a lot of discussion about essentially sort of like, are either of both of these happening right now? And one of the things that I find remarkable about US discourse on the issue is the fact that we're having this conversation. Is this a genocide or is this ethnic cleansing? I think 5 years ago, having that conversation about either of those labels being put on Israeli policy towards the Palestinians would have been discursively unheard of in the United States context. So I don't have a great answer for you because I am not an international legal scholar. So that's really what I got for you.
Can I add?
Yeah. Yeah, you just leave it up.
What we're seeing is an existential conflict on both sides between Israel and Hamas, though not necessarily the Palestinians, although that's debatable. The kind of attack that Hamas perpetrated, by the way, the Netanyahu government stopped spying on Hamas after 9/11, and the US outsourced spying on Hamas to Israel, which stopped spying on them. So none of the perhaps two most powerful intelligence organizations in the world was really watching them closely. And Netanyahu withdrew the Israeli troops from the border, relied on the passive structures to stop them. So it was very stupid. But the kind of attack and the social media advertising of it risks, if unavenged, from the point of view of the Israelis, making Israel unlivable. Many Israelis can leave. They can live elsewhere in the world. And if Israel becomes unlivable progressively over a period of years, that's pretty close to the end of the country. And therefore, the entire political spectrum in Israel, including the left, supports the idea, at least, of destroying Hamas, which is probably not possible. So, you know, they're going to try it. And Hamas, on the other hand, is in every possible way using the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip as shields. One of the most interesting ways is nobody's mentioned the tunnel network underneath Gaza, from which is Hamas's base. These are concrete reinforced tunnels. And the idea is to draw the Israelis in and take more Israelis, kill more Israelis, and take more of them hostage. It's not working that way because Israel is using they're using air power too heavily. And to kill one Hamas leader in a tunnel, they'll massacre a neighborhood with these bombs.
All right, another question. The young lady over there, yes, in the locker.
So I wanted to ask if there are any relations or connections between the Ukrainian war and the Hamas attack, and how do you think the UN is going to be managing the distribution of their resources to both situations?
Really good question.
Do you want to take that one, Dr. DeMars?
Sure. Thank you. The connection is that now Israel needs extra American military aid, and the three, naval forces sent to the region. President Biden is financing military aid not to Ukraine and to Taiwan. Ukraine is threatened, is invaded by Russia. Taiwan is threatened by China, and now Israel is the third. And the Biden administration doesn't raise military spending in general, it just sends new bills. So the latest one is $100 billion, most of it for Ukraine, second Taiwan, third Israel. There are not even enough F-16s to go around. The F-16s are built in Greenville, South Carolina, and they're not up to speed. In all three of these countries, the U.S. is trying to either sell or give, or our allies who have them are giving them in a combination. So we're not ready for this. Iran and Russia are increasing their ties, and even without communication, Iran knows that with challenges from China and Russia, if Iran throws another one on the table, and they have other proxies that can create other wars, they can stretch the United States too thin, either militarily or economically or in terms of American domestic politics. The leaders of Russia, China, and Iran think the United States is in decline and just needs a push.
Okay, let's take another question. I think maybe in the far back there, the young lady in the middle in the far back.
What do you think the role of Israeli propaganda is playing in the current conflict outside of Palestine? And do you think that propaganda is going to disseminate into the United States and other countries and affect our policy and legislation on the conflict?
Well, Dr. Gilbert, how about you take that?
Sure. So I think one of the things that's kind of interesting, and actually Dr. Vanderhill and I were talking about this earlier, is the fact that, right after Hamas's attack on Israel, the outpouring of support for Israel was significant. And then afterwards, the response to Gaza, which most experts in the region were like, okay, we know that what Israel generally does in response to any kind of attack out of Gaza is some sort of disproportionate response that kills a lot of Gazans. And so this is just, and we knew that this was going to be at an unimaginable scale. And just to give you sort of a sense, when we talk about the fact that over 10,000 Palestinians are killed, this means in the last month, we're talking about almost as many people as were killed in Iraq in 2003. And that is an entire country, let alone a strip that's only 26 miles long and 6 miles wide at its widest. So that attack, I think in some respects, actually, Israel has sort of bungled potential for propaganda and PR in a really epic way in the manner that they are carrying out these attacks. Now, I do think one of the things that's interesting about, this, like with Ukraine, right, is, conflicts that are unfolding in a new age of social media. So you don't necessarily have to go through kind of the old school traditional news filters to see, you get live stuff by people who are living in, in Gaza or in Israel at the click of a button. And what that means in terms of sort of how that's going to potentially polarize perspectives on both sides of this sort of issue, I think it's something that we're going to see continue to roll out in the coming months.
All right, another question. Okay, I got a couple back on this side of the room, so if you can make your way down
safely. Don't trip down the stairs.
Yeah, right over here.
Hey, what do you see as the role or the possible scope of the things that the international humanitarian community could kind of do right now in Gaza, especially given the fact that the borders are closed? Do we have any real ability to help the civilians there right now or not?
Reverend Robinson, would you want to take a start about the humanitarian option?
Yeah, I think there are some opportunities, and we can't just give up on those. Organizations like Save the Children are very much in place in Gaza, and they're very frustrated for the same reasons that you said. You know, these people are amazing, and by the way, a lot of those people who are peace activists and humanitarian workers were on that front line in Israel when Hamas invaded Israel. So it was a lot of them who died, actually. And I will also say, just the Hamas foundational documents are to eradicate Jews from the face of the earth. So that's also a genocide, right? So here are these aid workers going into the midst of this environment, realizing that all Palestinians aren't Hamas, but Hamas is all around. And it's very complicated. But there are organizations doing that. And there are also organizations, I heard last week that some of the weapons were being shipped to Israel through Belgium, and the Belgium dock workers and others refused to load them up on the ships and so forth. So there's some resistance to sending of weapons, which is also a humanitarian response on their part. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, we have time for, I think, one last question. So maybe there.
Do you think that Israel is heading down a path of becoming a failed state? And if so, do you think that this could be fixed by having a change in regime type from a parliament to a democracy?
This is a loaded question coming from my class. Can I answer it? Okay. I should start this by the fact that Comparing States and Societies just did a whole role playing of coalition building in the Israeli Knesset last week. Okay, so no, absolutely Israel is not headed toward the failed state. Now, what we do have is sort of a strong state capacity within Israel, but then within these areas, these occupied territories, these things that are not states, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, you don't have a state institution, right? So this is part of why the economic and humanitarian situation in these zones, particularly in Gaza being under blockade since 2007, are so dire, right? So there is no sort of established, okay, here's a regime, here's how we run elections, and the presentations I think did a really nice job of sort of trying to hammer that idea home. So it's this question of sort of how does this strong state deal with, the fact that they're essentially occupying territories, especially when it comes to the West Bank, and how do you deal with that level of occupation? Now, some of the dysfunction that we're seeing in terms of sort of the fact that Israeli coalitions in the Knesset keep getting built and then falling apart and keep getting built and then falling apart, and they have to keep running elections every year or two. They haven't made it to the full 4-year term since the 90s. So it's a very sort of unstable coalition building. Now, what that's going to mean, how this event is going to impact that, and what that means sort of which coalitions might be on the table in the future or might not, and what that could mean for actually future negotiations for the Palestinians, it's just too early to know at this point. So,
I think before
Can
we
I add
conclude,
something on that?
yes, if you're short, yeah.
Thank you. So on the topic of failed state, all the clients, all the states where Iran's proxies are failed states. And I'm quoting from Kareem Sajapour of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace in an interview with Ian Bremmer on his website G0 World. And he points out, if you look at the Middle East today, Iran is the dominant power in the region. The countries where it has enormous influence are essentially 5 failing states: Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. So Iran tends to thrive where there's chaos, where there's power vacuums. Iran really benefits from the misery of these populations, and it doesn't care about the Palestinians or the Arabs in these 5 countries. Iran does not want to see these populations become prosperous. And the more these populations experience conflict, Iran has tended to benefit from this despair of the Arab population. So according to Sajapour, this whole thing emanating from Iran is profoundly anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian, coming from these failed states.
I think before we conclude, because this is obviously a very difficult topic, right? There's very awful things that have been happening. And so I'm going to put Reverend Robinson on the spot here and ask him for a kind of concluding thought to maybe share some thoughts about peace building and maybe some thoughts about what people here at Wofford College maybe could do in terms of some of this dynamics and the real kind of challenging humanitarian consequences of this conflict.
Yeah, I think you're doing something right now that's really important. You're here and you're learning about this, and that's so important. At the beginning of the semester, I told the students in my class that there are many campuses where you can't talk about this subject, but we can talk about it here, and we'd like to keep it that way, right? And part of that, talking about it, is learning, hearing different perspectives, empathy, and that sort of thing. So your being here is actually hopeful. There are all sorts of aid organizations you can get in touch with. Look, it's a wicked problem, and that's a term that often comes from environmental studies, but it applies to this situation. There are not simple solutions. You solve one part and you activate another part. It's very complicated, and anything that you can become part of that can help move the collective will of people to stay with this, to envision a new future and move toward that is, I know that's idealistic, but we have to have that sort of idealism, right? Somebody has to put that vision forward, and I think the more you can engage in that, the better.
Thank you. Please join me with thanking our panelists today and all of our students.